Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Well, it is officially no longer Christmas. We can take down the lights and decorations and pack everything away. Yet here we are, celebrating the Feast of Epiphany, commemorating, among other things, one of the most famous gift exchanges in the world. Now, the gift-giving is just part of the Magi's tale, so I want to talk a little bit about the Magi and what we know about them. Magi, or magus, is an incredibly old word. References have been found going back to the 5th century BC in Greece, and even further away in China, going back another 300 years, so 800 years before the birth of Christ. Now, magus could mean several things. It could be a magician, an astronomer, an alchemist, or a follower of the Zoroastrian religion. Now, Matthew does not elaborate on what he means in using the term magi, but we can guess from their observations of the star that they were astronomers at the very least. Now, another thing we know about them is that they came from far away, hundreds, if not thousands, of miles from Israel. We know that they did not have access or know about the prophecies of Isaiah. They went to Herod asking where the king was born, and Herod had to go to the chief priests and scribes who made the reference to Isaiah. So what else do we know about them? Do we know how many magi there were? Well, the processional hymn today tells us there were 3, but the gospel is actually silent on that account. It says magi, which is a plural word, but never says exactly how many. Now, we in the West traditionally think of 3, probably because there were 3 gifts mentioned. But in Eastern Christian traditions, they think of 12 magi. Now, many of us could probably provide names for the magi if asked, but this is again a point on which the gospel is silent, and this also varies quite a bit depending on tradition. Now, as far as I could tell, in the East, they do not try to name their 12 magi. Now, for most of the Western church, we call them some variation of Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, while Syrian, Ethiopian, and Armenian churches each have their own unique list of names. Now, while we are trying to identify the Magi, it's worth noting that we are not even told if they're men or women or a mixed group. Now, the last thing I want to point out about what we know or do not know about the Magi is when they actually arrived in Bethlehem. We know they showed up late if they were trying to arrive for the birth, and that the arrival occurred today, but was it just 12 days after Jesus' birth? A year and 12 days? Or 12 days after his second birthday? Now, there's some debate with scholars on this point, and there's very little agreement, though this 2-year range seems to be the extremes that everyone can agree on. Now, I wanted to point out what we know about the Magi and what we think we know and what we know we don't know, not to try to show that anything we know is wrong or false, but to point out that based on the facts given in the gospel, the story of the Magi is far more complicated than we might realize. Now, that stands in stark contrast to the revelation to the shepherds, where angels came down directly and said, "Go to Bethlehem right now," and they went. Now, the story of the Magi foreshadows the way in which the bringing of the word to the Gentiles would eventually become Paul's mission. It was not direct, it was not simple. Paul met with objections along the way, obstacles to be overcome. It was an overland trip of hundreds or thousands of miles, following and interpreting signs of a star, not the short run from the sheep field. Now, I want to share another story that was not a direct path from beginning to end. This story is about the vicar of my church when I was very young. I think he may have been the priest who baptized me, but I don't remember that far back. So anyway, his name was Bill Masters, and he served as vicar of St. Clement's Episcopal Church in Greenville from as far back as I can remember until I was about 10 years old. I absolutely adored Father Bill. He wasn't one to have special youth services. I don't think those were invented in the early 80s, but he was always a very warm, and in particular, I remember that he would speak to kids like they were real people. Now, his time at our church came at the end of a complicated Magi-like story. You see, Father Bill was not ordained until his mid-60s. He was not fresh out of college, 20-something that I see in my seminary classes. No, Bill had a long career as an engineer, and from the stories I've heard, did not hear his call to ordained service until he had retired from that. What's more is he was a lifelong Lutheran, and when he heard a call, it was specifically to be an Episcopal priest. So much like the Magi, he came from far away. The Lutheran church in Greenville is right across the street from this, so very far. And he showed up late, at least late in his life. But did any of this matter to me as a child in his church? Did it matter to his parishioners? No, we didn't think, who is this old man who is a new priest? We embraced him for what he was at that time and for what he was doing, much like we do with the Magi. We didn't dwell on Father Bill's background or the path he took to become our vicar. We saw a man who had been called by God to become ordained and led our congregation faithfully and well for almost a decade. We don't get hung up on the number of Magi that Matthew's talking about, nor their names or whether they were magicians, astronomers, or kings. We focus on what they were and are doing as it relates to the story of Jesus. They were outsiders. They were educated, and they endured a great hardship to reach him. It does not matter if they showed up 12 days after the Nativity, 377, or even 742. What matters is that they read the signs they were given, and they set out on a journey they were supposed to, and eventually they did show up. And thanks be to God that they did. It was this arrival and the inclusion of outsiders that led Paul to bring the word to the Gentiles, and through them to the rest of what will become the church. As Paul explained to the Ephesians, in former generations this mystery was not made known to humankind, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets through the Spirit. That is, the Gentiles have become fellow heirs. The birth of Jesus gave us a direct connection to God, one that was not just reserved for the chosen people of Israel, but for all who would hear and believe. The Gentiles have become fellow heirs. There's that same word from last week, bringing up the nahalah we received from God, the inheritance and responsibility. Now, I have to admit, I find a lot of comfort knowing how effective Father Bill was as our parish priest, even coming to it so late in life. I find that I worry about it for myself, having started on the same path slightly earlier than he did, but far later than I would have wanted. I ask myself, is it too late? Have I been wasting my time up until now? I don't know the answer. But I like to think that something in his experience and life as an engineer made Bill the priest that he was, made him something he wouldn't have been if he had not waited. The same is true with the Magi. They were late if we expect them to show up on the night of Jesus' birth, but they weren't late if their role was to spark the inclusion of the Gentiles. They were as late as God intended or allowed them to be. That is where I really find my hope. That it was intended, not that I respond to a call until this time. It's something I think almost everyone can relate to. You look back, seeing something we would have done, or done better, done differently, seeing something we might feel called to do now, but thinking it's too late to start or might not be enough to really make a difference. The key is, none of that is actually true. If we had done something perfectly the first time, we wouldn't be thinking about it later, learning from an apparent mistake. If we feel called to do something, even a small thing, it is on us to respond, to live up to that responsibility as heirs to God. There's an ancient Chinese proverb, and given that the Magi came from the East, I don't think it's too out of place. The proverb goes, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." For the Magi, the best time to set out following the star might have been 12 days or 742 days earlier, but the second best time was when they did set out. For Father Bill, the best time to become a priest might have been at 22, but the second best time was at 65 when he was ordained. For myself, or for any of us, the best time to act was in the past, but the second best time is today. Have faith that you will only be as late as God allows or intends you to be. Have faith, but keep your eyes open. Look for the stars and the signs that might guide you. Be open to the Spirit, because chances are that none of us are going to get as lucky as the shepherds did and have an angelic messenger simply tell us what to do. We need to use the tools that God has given us, our intellect, our intuition, and our instincts, in an attempt to find and decipher the signs that show up in our own complicated stories. Whether we find ourselves confronted with opposition like Paul did, a long and daunting journey like the Magi, or simply our own doubt, we need to have faith in God to give us direction in ways that we can understand. We must do our best, try our hardest, but always remember that the measure of our best is wholly reliant on what God has given to us and requires of us. Like the Magi, we can only ever arrive late, but in a way that fulfills the role God has given to us. Amen.